In September 2007, Sephora stated in an email message that while looking in her files for documentation of the date Ewald and Ruby moved from Abernathy to the ranch in 1944, she found a small file crate of material brought to her home after Ruby's funeral, and which had not seen the light of day since. Contained therein were some pictures, a couple of her mother's journals, as well as a copy of another of her journals, and copies of Grandmother Remembers books she prepared for 3 of her grandchildren. There were other invaluable treasures too, including Ewald's birth certificate and Ewald and Ruby's marriage license. Ewald Herman Fuchs, oldest child of Albano and Guinea Fuchs, was born in his parents' home in Burnett County on March 20th, 1902. As a young man, he attended mechanics classes at Texas A&M. While picking cotton at his uncle Bruno Fox's home place near Abernathy in October 1924, Ewald met a lovely young woman picking cotton with her family, Ruby Lee Barrick, who was born on May 20th, 1902, near Cross Plains, Texas. Her family had recently moved there from Eastland County and were renting a farm from Uncle Bruno, which adjoined the farm Ewald rented. Ewald and Ruby began dating, going to church, to one movie, and visiting friends and relatives. Their courtship had lasted only 2 months when they secretly made plans to get married. As the Albano Fox family was sitting down for Christmas Eve dinner at their home nearby on December 24, 1924, Albano received a phone call and then announced that Caroline had just eloped with Ernest Park. Describing that day years later, Ruby recalled planning it secretly, getting dressed and being casual about it. Caroline and Ernest had married a few hours before, and when Ewald found out, he said, "They're not going to get ahead of me," and he came over and got me. My parents thought we were just going out a little while on a date. We went to Petersburg, a few miles east of Abernathy, and got married. Ewald drove a car that belonged to his dad. They married at 10 p.m. that night. Thus, the Fox family had 2 weddings to celebrate on that same day. In the early years of their marriage, Ewald and Ruby's only means of transportation was a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and he traveled around on it, following the wheat harvest in Nebraska and the Midwest. Ewald and Ruby first lived in a small 3-room house on a farm that Ewald had rented. It was located across the road from Albano and Guinea's big farmhouse. Avery and Cheryl were born there, and they lived on the farm until the children were a few years old. They then moved to Albano and Guinea's large ranch in Lee County, New Mexico, and lived for a short while there on the whining place. Around 1929, they moved to Ingleside near Corpus Christi, Texas, where Ewald worked as a machinist at a humble oil refinery. They lived in Ingleside for 8 years. In 1937, Ewald and Ruby moved their family to a farm they had purchased in Hell County, 6 or 7 miles west of Abernathy. While they were waiting for the people to vacate, Sephora was born at a place Ruby's brother Hilburn had rented. Avis and Roland met there. John, Jerry, and Laura Sue were born on their farm. Ewald raised maize and cotton on the farm, and he also had a dairy and sold milk to a local cheese factory owned by his uncles Fritz and Ben Struve. In 1944, they moved onto George's Warren Place near Albano and Guinea's Ranch in New Mexico. Later that year, they were living in Hobbs, where Ewald worked as a mechanic. They lived in the big house on Ewald's parents' ranch for a year, and then they sharecropped in Lamesa, Texas for a year. In late 1947, at the end of the harvest season, they moved to Lincoln County and lived in a small house that belonged to George and Mildred. It was located directly across the road from the Fox Mercantile. In the spring of 1948, Ewald and his family moved onto the former Stetson place, which became the delightful Hidden Valley Fruit Farm on the Ruidoso River, just a few miles east of present-day Ruidoso Downs, New Mexico. A large apple orchard made up the main section of the farm, and it was a wonderful playground for visiting nephews and nieces. Hollis was born in Roswell a few weeks later. In the 1950s, Ewald worked in the maintenance department for the Ruidoso schools. In the mid-1970s, Ewald and Ruby left their farm and moved to Abernathy to care for the ailing grandmother Barrick. After Mrs. Barrick's death in October 1976, they stayed on her farm until Ewald's death 2 months later, on December 12th. On the day of Ewald's funeral, on December 15, 1976, the family gathered for a group photo in front of Hilburn Barrick's home in Abernathy. The following tribute, composed by all of his children, was read at his funeral service. We, the sons and daughters of Ewald Fuchs, acknowledge and cherish the attributes of our Father, which have given meaning to our lives and which we endeavor to impart to our children and our children's children through his example by our lives. Our Father loved our mother with tenderness, faithfulness, sincerity, and devotion. Together, 52 years, they set an example of fidelity, determination, sharing, and caring. He loved us, each of us, and each of our own, without reservation. So great was his love that he would have given his life in exchange for any of ours. He showed us and he told us he loved us. He believed in the value of the family unit, revered his forebears, honored his parents, and cherished his brothers and sisters and each of their children. Each in-law was his sister, his brother, or his child. He respected quality in the individual, in work, in workmanship, in knowledge, learning, and education. He was a conservationist, keenly concerned with the preservation of living things and natural resources. He loved nature, the great outdoors. He watched the sun, the moon, the stars, the weather, and the changing seasons. He shared with us his observations and appreciation, always in subtle ways. He taught us to see beauty in the smallest things and brought wildflowers as loving gifts to our mother. He lived a clean life, moral, honest, unselfish, and simple. His sense of humor was ever present and included everyone. The message from his teasing, gentle jokes, and folksy anecdotes was to separate what must be taken seriously from what needn't be. Perhaps the greatest principle upon which he based his life was his interpretation of the Golden Rule. The most important things we do are the things we do for others. For us, our Father was the biggest man in the world. December 15, 1976. Ewald Ruby, Cheryl Herman, Sephora Joy, John Alden, Jerry Clinton, Laura Sue, Ewald Hollis. Ruby then moved back to the farm near Ruidoso and stayed there for a number of years. She eventually moved to Capitan, living across the street from son Hollis and his family, until her death on March 1, 1990.